We'll be starting with the next session, clinical interpretation and expectations from our clinicians. Like as lab persons, like I'm a pathologist, what we expect from the clinicians and also vice versa. So now here today we have with us Dr. Apurva Puranik, is DM Neurology from AIIMS New Delhi. He has been gold medalist during his MBBS days, and he has 37 years of experience in the field of neurology. He has achieved Charak Award for Exemplary Medical Service, and which is the highest honor from IMA, and is also an author and publisher of large corpus of health education literature. And also he has made many documentary films. So now we start with our discussion. So over to Dr. Puranik. Good evening. So firstly, I as a pathologist would like to hear from you regarding what are the expectations of clinicians from the lab. So if you could throw light on that.
I'm glad to join this panel, and as I wanted to emphasize that CSF cerebrospinal fluid is often an emergency test. Of course, it can be a non-emergency test also, but and this mistake is done equally by both the ends. So none of us is as good as all of us. There is a value for collaboration. So I think if this meeting, CAHO, can push for a need for a standard operating procedure for the institutions and for CSF, it can have some value, some formal force and to be implemented by clinicians as well as the pathologists. And here comes the role of insistence and reminders by the lab to the clinic. We clinicians are prone to forget. And what is a good referral and requisition note, particularly in case of an emergency CSF, as the patient may come with meningitis, encephalitis, meningoencephalitis, subarachnoid hemorrhage in the middle of the night. It is the duty of the clinician to inform the lab that within few minutes you will be receiving a CSF sample. The clinicians need to ensure ample volume. It should be collected in 3 test tubes, particularly if you want to differentiate traumatic from subarachnoid hemorrhage. The need for a standard operating procedure, a good requisition note, prior intimation of an emergency CSF, need for ample volume, need to collect in 3 test tubes, and separate tubes for cytology and sterile tubes for culture, and simultaneous blood samples. All these things need to be hammered upon the clinicians, and part of the hammering, of course, we will put our own house in order, but if the lab keeps on reminding them, that will help. So time is essence, and as I said, CSF is often an emergency test. What is the needle to microscope time? That means the moment you start collecting the CSF, and if the time is longer, more than say half an hour, the cells get lysed rapidly by RBCs, WBCs, and what you get a false negative cell count for infectious conditions like meningitis. So you miss a diagnosis if there is a delay. Needle to culture medium time should ideally be 0. I remember in NIMHANS, Bangalore, the microbiology department and the clinical departments were so attuned to each other that if there was an emergency and a meningitis was suspected, the resident from the microbiology departments will come to the bedside, and as the lumbar puncture is coming, the fluid drops would be directly collected into the culture medium. So the needle to culture medium time should be 0 seconds at the bedside. Needle to chemistry time should also be as short as possible. And as Dr. Jay was telling a minute back, we need a centrifuge in a side lab where it can be centrifuged, the sample, so that it will help in differentiating a traumatic CSF from subarachnoid hemorrhage, and also it will help in creating a cell button from which the smears can be made. So the clinicians need to be trained, or there can be accomplices from the pathology and the side lab who can help them in centrifugation. There is unfortunately practice that sometimes, not always, sometimes a blood mixed CSF, particularly if it is traumatic, is discarded, but it should not be done, because For each 1000 RBC, there can be 1 to 2 WBC. So you have to do both the counts, RBC count and WBC count. And you can say whether the WBCs are still increased more than this proportion, as it can happen in subarachnoid hemorrhage and meningitis. Crenation of RBCs can be helpful in determining protein. So protein estimation can also be done in a traumatic test. If there are 1000 RBCs, it will lead to a rise of only 1 milligram of protein, and you can still interpret it. Sugar will remain valid and reliable. If at all, mixture of blood with the CSF will tend to increase the CSF sugar a little bit, but not too much, because it is usually not a lot of volume of blood which is mixed into CSF. It is only a few drops of blood which will give a red color to the traumatic tap. And then if the traumatic tap is allowed to stand in one of the two tubes, which is not centrifuged, it will clot immediately, while the blood in a subarachnoid hemorrhage will not clot. I want to emphasize that whenever we send CSF, following should be routine, but some of them are neglected. So centrifugation for cytology button, urgent centrifugation in case of hemorrhagic CSF, because the supernatant xanthochromia is very important in the diagnosis of subarachnoid hemorrhage. Third is staining for differential cell count. I think there are some shortcomings on this front, and the stains which should be used should be done more rigorously. And I believe cytology should be done more routinely. What is the role of preservative fluid? What is the role of millipore filter and cell fixation? I would like to learn from the experts in this field. And this is a question from my side. Can the following become part of routine? They are currently not part of routine. They are currently requested as and when necessary, depending on the clinical situation. But in the coming years, if the cost effectiveness becomes favorable, as the technology advances, the prices go down, as the volume and turnover increases, the cost can go down. So I'm just asking this question, can these things become part of routine? Special cell separation with immunostaining without asking. Protein electrophoresis and immunochemistry, serology for various infectious antigens and antibodies, spectrophotometry for pigments like oxyhemoglobin or methemoglobin, and special cultures including viruses. Now, all these things, I do not know how much is the cost involved, whether it would be cost effective for the general public or not. Should it be restricted only when a clinician is suspecting, or some of them gradually can be incorporated as a part of a routine testing? That was a query or a curiosity on my mind. I can take questions now, I believe.
So that you are right. Few of the things can be incorporated during routine cytological examination. And of course, we as the lab people, as pathologists, and also in the biochemistry field, we would always like that a fully complete, fully filled rather, a requisition form is sent to the lab along with the provisional clinical diagnosis. So that would be really good on behalf of the clinicians. Dr. Puranik, one question I would like to ask you, which is lab related, like why culture positivity rates are so low for CSF samples? If you could throw some light on this.
I do not know, because whenever I read literature from other countries, their culture positivity rates are fairly high, be it bacterial or tubercular or fungal.
Okay.
In India, even I think the best rates were from enhanced microbiology. The reasons are multiple. Number one, as I said, the inoculation interval should be 0. It should be as short as possible. As the drops are coming, the CSF should be inoculated immediately and as soon as possible. The volume of CSF is important. Larger the volume, higher would be the culture positivity rate. Number 3 is the variety of culture medium. So instead of one variety, you can have 2, 3 aerobic, anaerobic, and all sorts of bacteria and fungal mediums. So variety of culture mediums. Number 4 is prior use of antibiotics by the patient. So the patient who already received antibiotics, their culture positivity rate would be low. So these are some of the reasons.
Okay. Dr. Puranik, I would also like to ask you, like, as a clinician, what is your opinion about processing of a traumatic CSF in the lab? You often come across traumatic CSF.
I have already referred to this in my slide presentation, but I will speak out the salient points. Number 1, the traumatic sample should not be discarded. Number two, it should be collected in at least 2 tubes or 3 tubes and see whether the RBC count is going down or not. If it is a uniformly hemorrhagic subarachnoid hemorrhage, the RBC count will be same in all the 3 test tubes. But in the case of a traumatic CSF, the density of blood in the first tube would be highest and will be lowest in the third tube. Number two, one of the tubes should be centrifuged immediately on the bedside or near the lab. And if it is a traumatic CSF, after the centrifugation, the blood will settle down while the supernatant would remain clear. If it was a prior subarachnoid hemorrhage which has occurred in the brain itself, in that case, in the hemorrhagic CSF, the RBCs will settle down, but the supernatant would be xanthochromic or yellow in color because the RBCs have already been started the process of lysis. So the bilirubin has started getting liberated in the CSF. And the third was that even if you are suspecting meningitis or encephalitis and you want to know what is the cell count, what is the protein level, what is the glucose level, so they should still be tested. The cell count should be tested and you can make a correction for 1000 RBCs to 1 WBC. You can make a correction of protein as 1 milligram of protein rise for 100 for 1000 RBCs and a slight increase about 20% of increase in the CSF sugar if it is blood mixed. So there are correction formulas or correction factors for cell count, for protein and for glucose. And of course, a traumatic CSF can still be sent for culture if you are suspecting a meningitis infective pathology.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Pauranik. Other question for you. What is the significance of albuminocytological dissociation? I want to hear from the neurologist perspective.
Albuminocytological dissociation means that the CSF proteins are elevated, but the cells are normal or only marginally elevated, not significantly elevated. It is not the other way around. Theoretically, it could have been other way around. That is, the cells were high and the protein was low. And literally, it would be a dissociation, second type of dissociation. But when we use this term, we only mean one type of dissociation. Proteins are high, and by protein we mean albumin because albumin is the main protein in CSF. Continue that albuminocytological dissociation is a very common finding. There are so many conditions in neuropathology, in clinical neurology, where it is possible to have rise in the CSF protein. So the normal protein is around 50. The protein might be increased to 50, 60, 70, 80, or even higher. While the cell count remains low, then it is called albuminocytological dissociation. It has been often considered as diagnostic of Guillain-Barré syndrome, AIDP, acute inflammatory demyelinating polyradiculoneuropathy, acute neuropathy, and also in CIDP, chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyradiculoneuropathy. But that is not so because CSF rise in protein while cell count being normal can occur in cerebral infarction, can occur in hemorrhage, can occur in multiple sclerosis, can occur in tumors which are close to the CSF surface, post-contusion. There are a whole lot of 20, 30, 40 clinical conditions in which albuminocytological dissociation can occur, and it has very minimum diagnostic value. If it is seen out of context clinical situation. So as long as we are paying attention to the clinical situation, this has some diagnostic value, particularly for demyelinating and inflammatory conditions, not infective, but inflammatory and demyelinating pathologies and sometimes neoplastic pathologies, albuminocytological dissociation can occur.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pauranik.